She mentioned all of her books are on the back table. I'm sure if you ask nicely, she'll sign them for you. Up next, we have Amber. Amber Elby is the author of 3 novels based on Shakespeare's plays, Cauldron's Bubble, Double Double Toil, and the newest, Trouble Fires Burn. She earned her MFA in screenwriting at the University of Texas at Austin, and she teaches at Austin Community College. Please welcome Amber.
Thank you for coming out today, everyone. I really appreciate your support. I also want to give a shout out to my cover artist, beautiful covers, Brandy, who's sitting right there in the back row. So, she'll sign these also. I'm sure if you ask her, I brought extra pens for you. And thank you, Beth, for coming out and joining me today. I appreciate it. So everyone check out Beth's books after this. I decided today that I'm not going to exclusively read from my newest book, Trouble Fires Burn. I'm going to start out by reading from Cauldron's Bubble. I never actually read the first chapter at my book launch. I read some other parts in it. So I want to start here, and then we'll move into Trouble Fires Burn after this. So chapter 1, it's called Midwinter Night's Dream. Alda hesitated on the bridge, alone for the first time, in the vast middle of the night, the witching time of night. Snow hovered, forming fantastic shapes in the new electric lights that lined the street. She did not notice the winter's chill, or the sharp shadows around her, or the static hum that echoed through the longest night of the year. Instead, Alda focused on the water below as she leaned on the icy railings. The Grand River swirled beneath the bridge, as black and solemn as the skirt that slapped against her legs, as wild as her raven hair that waved in the wind and snow. She should cry. She knew she should cry, and she always did as she should. Even though she was sick at heart, she was complacent, compliant, and calm. But that was all before she was alone on the bridge. Even though she focused on the water, Alda did not see it, not really. Instead, in her mind's eye, she saw the dark soil as it was dropped unceremoniously on her grandmother's grave. She saw how the earth separated her from the one person she had ever loved and trusted, the only soul she ever really knew. A world was now between her and her grandmother, and all seemed lost. The stoplight atop the post next to her flickered and went out with a hiss and a fountain of sparks. The new electricity was unreliable and, as Alda had said before, terrifying in its novelty, almost magical. As she stood watching the river, wondering at her inability to cry, the other lights likewise flickered and went out. Now Alda was alone and in near total darkness. It was a sign, perhaps, or an omen, that she should go elsewhere, leave. She crossed the bridge away from the cemetery, carefully treading over the ice in her soft leather shoes, down the bank toward the river, onto the ledge path that skirted the sandstone cliffs on the riverbank, past the carvings and the protruding rocks, the graffiti of the hordes of visitors who flocked to Grand Ledge every summer. She could have perceived the wooden roller coaster spanning the resort island, rising in the river like a sea monster, or the Folly Hotel silhouetted above like a fairy tale tower. But she did not look to these familiar sights as she tread reflexively toward the farthest, smallest island, home. She reached the mural of the 3 animals near Lionhead Rock. The mural inscribed, "When shall we 3 meet again?" To her right, a smaller path led directly to the river, to the rickety bridge that crossed to their cottage on the 7th island. Her cottage now, not theirs. Once inside, she lit the gas lamp as she had so many times before. But now its light fell on an empty chair next to the fireplace and the untouched stereoscope at the end table. She was not greeted with the clink of a spoon in a bowl or the bubbling of soup in a cast iron pot. There was no smile, no happy voice in the quaint, cold cottage. Not even a mouse stirred. Yet the smell lingered. Lavender, thyme, sage, rosemary. Rosemary, that's for remembrance, her grandmother would say. Now the herbs were all bundled neatly with twine above the wooden kitchen table. The smells of her grandmother's cooking, of feast, of happiness, of grandma, gone. Alda suddenly felt weak, exhausted, and lowered herself onto a creaking chair at the kitchen table. She remembered the previous Christmas, when she was 13, how her grandmother somehow negotiated with a butcher on Bridge Street for a Christmas ham. They had no money, at least not enough for a ham, but Grandma had a way with words and convinced the man to part with it as Alda watched, amazed, through the store window. That night, despite their transitory happiness, was the beginning of the end. It was the start of her grandmother's lapses, her strange exclamations and questions. As the ham cooked in a Dutch oven, the older woman glanced at Alda and mumbled almost to herself, "When I saw you the last time, your hair was longer, but not much." Alda, confused, touched her black hair, reassuring herself it was unchanged. But I've never cut it. Grandma pressed her lips into a line and nodded absent-mindedly, again looking into the fire. Alda, her attention back in the present, felt an illogical, overwhelming sense of fury. It was not fair, none of it. Her grandmother's forgetfulness, madness, death, her own responsibility, burden, and grief. Fury turned to rage, and Alda turned to destruction. She grasped the herbs above her head and pulled the bundles down around her wildly, crushing them into thousands of pieces in her fists. And she cried, finally, as the overwhelming sense brought unwelcome emotions and overpowering memories. She tried to wipe her tears, but the herbs on her hands stung her eyes, so she collapsed onto the table and sobbed into her arms. After some time, and many regrets and sorrows, she lifted her head, wiped the tears away with her black sleeve, and picked the crushing herbs from between her fingers. As her focus shifted from her fingertips to the tabletops, Alda let out a quiet scream and jumped back in fear and surprise. She hesitated and leaned forward, studying what could not be explained. She looked away, far out the window at the river in the moonlight, and back again. It was still there. Written in perfect script on the kitchen table, in the tiny crumblings of the herbs mixed with the tears that had pooled beneath her eyes, was a single word: cloak. The letters were too perfect, the lines too precise to be accidental. This was not by chance. This was not natural. This was something that Alda could not rationalize, but she inexplicably understood the single word, the message. She turned to her grandmother's cloak that still hung on a hook near the door. Instinctively, Alda buried her hand within its lining until she found a shallow, hidden pocket. She felt a small shock as her fingers enclosed something cold and smooth. Carefully, gently, Alda removed the object and turned toward the lamplight as she uncurled her shaking fingers. In her palm was a perfect, iridescent sphere. It was the size of a marble, but transparent, almost like a bubble, a delicate bubble that was unexpectedly heavy and solid. As she turned to the mysterious object in the dimming light, a strange sensation engulfed her, a feeling like slipping into a warm bath after a trek in the snow. Alda smiled for the first time in weeks, calmed by the sensation washing over her. She squeezed the sphere in her fist, and then she was gone, vanished into nothing. The gaslight flickered in the empty cottage and then went out as a cold draft swept the herbs into the air. The smell of rosemary lingered. So that's half of the first chapter of my first book. And before I wrote that, I actually had another chapter in mind that I knew needed to be written. At first, I imagined it being in the first book, but when I thought about it more, I realized it needs to be in the final book. It's my reimagining of Hamlet's gravedigger scene, which is Act 5, Scene 1, if you know the play. And it's kind of a perfect scene. It starts out with a sense of irony in Shakespeare's play, where the audience knows that Hamlet's true love in quotation marks, Ophelia, is being buried. Hamlet's unaware of this. And he walks into the scene, and it's a comedic scene, but it's also frustrating for the audience because they're aware of things that Hamlet isn't. And it's kind of the turning point for the play. And so I wanted to recreate the scene, to re-envision it with my characters. And it's a turning point in my book. There have been spoilers that are redacted, so if you're like, that's a strange transition between those sentences, that is because there is something missing. But it's chapter 19, which, in Trouble Fires Burn, the title of the chapter is Fortune Brings in Some. The cemetery was at once familiar and foreign. The summer leaves, Alda remembered, had turned yellow against the dark greens and blues of the pines. But even though the sun was only a sliver on the horizon, Alda easily found her way toward her grandmother's earthly resting place. Yet as she approached its simple flagstone, she felt as though she was being watched. It was an unnerving sensation, something she had not experienced during her so many previous visits since her grandmother's passing the previous winter. Alda turned in place, feeling more curiosity than dread in this garden of death. Then Alda saw a ghostly form beneath a blue spruce. Half a man, only a torso and arms, its incomplete silhouette obscured in shadows and movement. Hesitant, Alda approached, doing her best to always have at least one headstone between herself and the phantom. 10 paces, 20, 30. Alda was nearly upon the figure when he, laughed. And she realized that this was not some ghost or ghoul. It was a man holding a warden spade, standing in an open grave, a grave digger. His eyes smiled as he again looked at her, but his mouth and nose were covered by a dusty bandana. Despite his mask, Alda recognized him as the the same man who had buried her grandmother amid laughter and inappropriately jolly songs. Here again after so long. I visit less frequently than I did before. Alda paused and added, as if apologizing, I have been away. I envy you and wish my visits were as seldom. He grunted as he continued to dig. His accent was strange, distant. He was not from Michigan. After several heartbeats of silence, Alda felt a wave of recognition and wondered aloud, have we met elsewhere? I know you, yes, and your handiwork. He paused long enough to wink at the bundle of foliage in Alda's hand, and she understood. He added slyly, you wreath my hand's work. While plants were important to Grandma, more silence. I should go. She turned once again toward her destination, but the jovial man cleared his throat as he dug. What's past is prologue. Alda again faced him. What do you mean? That's what this grave will say, or what it will read. Rather, what those who read it will say to themselves. It's a kind of poetry, no? The man stopped digging and met her eyes, his mouth and nose still covered. I suppose, Alda hesitated, and ironic. Why? To think that life is prologue, for what? For death? Despite herself, she choked on something like a laugh. For whatever comes next. He leaned on the spade and wiped his brow. Poetic irony, the end is the beginning. That's just nonsense. Spoken like someone who knows sense, or one who has lost it. Alda shook her head and said, more seriously than she intended, I doubt I ever had it. Not enough sense, at least, or good. Bad sense. She nodded. And now? I have even less. The man cleared his throat. In what sense? Again, Alda suppressed a laugh, amused. In every sense. But you can still smell and see and hear and taste. You have all five. You forgot feeling, Alda corrected. You may have lost that. It is easily deposited here with the senseless. Alda started to understand his word game, his equivocation. Death is senseless. The man nodded, still gazing at her eyes. Sometimes. There was an unusual pause between his words. No, always. Death is always senseless, useless for naught. It is deaf and mute and tasteless. Tears formed in her eyes, but it reeks, and it touches too much. The man shifted and broke their gaze, his eyes turning to the empty grave in which he stood. A sudden thought occurred to Alda, and her curiosity escaped her lips. Have you ever buried someone whom you love? I do not bury anyone. Well, have you ever dug a grave for anyone close to you? The graves I dig make them far. No, I mean, have you dug a grave for anyone that you love? I do not dig graves for anyone, nor do I bury anyone. Only anybody. He chuckled on the final word. Alda's frustration darkened her tone. You know what I mean. My knowledge is mean, the man snorted. No, I was serious. And you, Alda faltered. She should not have asked. The question was too personal. It was rude to prod a stranger thus. I'm sorry, He held up a hand, stopping her. Without my wit, I am nothing. All is jest here. Laughter is what separates the living from the dead. And dirt, and decay, Alda sighed, and time. Time is all they have now, and it is what we lack, what we are missing. He motioned to the surrounding graves. But they all stood here at one time or another and looked at these stony faces as we look upon them now. Alda wiped a tear from her cheek, and the man's tone changed to something softer as he continued. Look there, at that red granite monument. He nodded toward a waist-height gravestone, its top arched and carved with two clasped hands. Alda walked closer to it, and the gravedigger prodded, Read it. The words were covered in moss, so Alda wiped it away as she squinted in the dim light and read, Stranger, pause as you pass by. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, soon you shall be. So welcome death, and follow me. Alda stood upright and rubbed her back as she once again faced the gravedigger. It calls me to death. I have half a heart to follow.